I started teaching as a volunteer at San Quentin in 2013. And it's funny, but like Allison in the passage that you just heard, every time I would go into the prison, I would find myself wondering how someone could escape. I don't know why I wondered that, but I did. Maybe I'm just a criminal at heart. And it was kind of a puzzle in my mind over the years. And I can remember a few occasions when someone would say to me, when they found out I taught at San Quentin, "Oh, I bet you could write a short story about that." And I always said, "Oh, I don't have any ideas for such a story, so probably not." And then I retired from my teaching job in 2018, was working on a series of short stories set in a fictionalized version of my hometown in Kentucky in the 50s and 60s. Finished that soon after the pandemic started and thought, okay, so what am I going to write now? And suddenly I just imagined this character, probably some version of myself, working as a volunteer teacher at San Quentin, wondering about that same old question: how would someone escape? And so from that point, the novel just grew. This teacher became female. I thought of the character she might help escape. That was James. And from there, the novel just grew. And thanks to the pandemic, in a way, where the only things I did were walk the dog in the hills, mask up and go to the grocery, and write. So I finished the first draft in about 6 months, spent another couple years doing revisions and rewriting, and that's where the novel came from.
Great, thank you so much. While we're talking about origins, I wanted to ask you about the question of influences, because the book really explores the role of influences in our lives. Both James and Allison, the book's two protagonists, are strongly influenced by people that they look up to. James is inspired as a young boy by the example of George Washington Carver and his contributions to agricultural science, and his love of animals and nature. Allison is inspired by reading Nancy Drew novels and problem solving. And so I was wondering if you could tell us about early influences in your life and how they relate to your becoming a writer.
I always find it hard to explain, how I got to be the person that I am. I think that's very difficult. A few things come to mind, and they're actually not literary influences per se. One is the fact that I've always liked making things. When I was a really young boy, I used to go down to my grandfather's shop. He was a tailor in this small Kentucky town, dressing the business class of this town of 8,000 men and women, making suits. And I would gather scraps of fabric from the floor and sew them together to make, who knows what. At age 5, I knew how to thread a needle at least. And I just loved making things. And my grandmother, who was from Germany, I used to help her bake cookies, and I was fascinated by how she could make pastries in the kitchen. My other grandmother, who lived on a dairy farm, I would see them bring her in the morning a pail of milk from the barn, and she would churn her own butter and then make cookies from that. So I just loved making things. And later as an adult, I became serious about photography and I had my own darkroom. I loved making and matting photographs. So I really think of writing as making. To me, it's making a story. I feel like an old world craftsman dealing, like like the shoemaker, but instead of leather, I'm working with words and trying to build stories out of it. And I think that's a large part of how I became a writer. The other is that as a really young kid, I like hearing stories. My mother read to me a lot when I was really young, and my grandmother, the one who lived on the farm, I have this vivid memory of sitting on her porch. It's a big thing in the South to sit on the porch and listen to stories. She would tell these fascinating stories, from her own life, and I just loved listening to them. I would ask her to tell them again. We'd sit on the porch. I'd say, "Tell me about the time the house burned down," and she would. And she had one story that I still remember so vividly of how when she was a little girl, the local Ku Klux Klan rode up on horseback, drug her father out of the house, and threatened to horsewhip him because he had been speaking badly around town about the Klan. And her mother came onto the porch carrying a Bible in one hand, an American flag in the other, berated them all, and they hung their heads and, rode away. So, I was just mesmerized by stories. And I think those are some of the reasons that I eventually became a kind of storyteller.
And did you start writing stories as a young boy?
Mostly not. I do remember when I was in the 4th grade writing a short story. I had, for the first time I think in my life, I had fallen in love. And I had fallen in love with a girl who, unfortunately for me, was a senior high school cheerleader. So she was 17 and I was 9. This was not going to work. But I wrote a story about it. So already I knew that, what do you do with heartbreak? Put it into a story. Your heart will still be broken, but you'll feel better somehow. So that's maybe the only story I remember writing. Another strong memory of mine is on that day that all people of my generation remember very well, November 22nd, 1963. Principal comes on the loudspeaker and says the president has been shot. And one of the guys in my class said, "I hope he dies." And that so affected me that I wrote a think piece for the school newspaper. And I sort of remember it as the first piece of writing I ever did that seemed to me important. And then, in fact, I went to college, became a student journalist, got into trouble. This was the 60s, and the paper had become a kind of champion for causes, civil rights, student power, opposed to the war in Vietnam. This was Purdue. And the president of the university fired me as editor of the paper. The campus rose up in protest. He had to back down, and I continued as editor. But that sort of cemented my commitment to writing, I think. And then from there, I went on to start writing fiction. I'm a very slow learner, so it took decades. Eventually, had a story published, and as much as I could while I was teaching, I began to write fiction. And then when I retired, I was really finally realizing a lifelong dream of being a full-time writer.
Your comments about being a newspaper journalist too make me think about the dialogue between fact and fiction in any novel, what's real and what you imagine. One of the things that struck me about this novel is how many details there are about things that you haven't experienced firsthand, life in prison for one thing, from the point of view of an inmate. So I wanted to ask you, you taught at San Quentin literature and film classes, but how did you go about the process of researching things that you hadn't experienced directly?
I did do research of various kinds. I mean, what I'm writing is realistic fiction. And those two words in some ways are in kind of tension with one another. Realism means it could, it's the real world and it could happen like this. No talking animals or, flying elephants in this fiction. But it's also, so it's realistic, but it's made up. Allison never existed, James never existed, and so on. So to fill in the realistic parts, there were a wide variety of things that I researched for the novel. I mean, for one thing, in almost all of my fiction, I do have it grounded in a very specific historical period, and there will often be references to things that are really happening, and so I have to get the details right, the dates right. I don't use outlines when I write, but for this novel, I actually had a timeline of the years, so I had to know when the O.J. trial took place, the Felix Mitchell funeral in Oakland, and so on. And occasionally there were things I had to research, like how to make Pruno, the details of what parole board hearings are like, things of that sort. And then for the prison, I mean, I've always been, I have a long list of things I'm not good at and a short list of things I am good at. And one of the things I'm good at is being a close listener and observer. I think probably like a lot of writers, I'm sort of a voyeur by nature. And so I just remembered a lot of things I would observe in prison, things I would overhear, and those got, woven into a lot of the details that you refer to.
You mentioned the making of Pruno, which some people in this audience obviously know what that is, but some others probably don't. And this leads us to our next reading.